A 50mm prime is a lens that has you covered for pretty much anything. In my experience, the 50mm focal length is not just a lens that you could use for 90% of your work, but in my opinion, it is a lens that you should use for most of your work. And in this video, I'm going to get into why it is by far my most used focal length for portraits, weddings, and so much more. So right now, my holy trinity free lens setup is the 15-35 for my wide shots, a 50mm prime for pretty much everything, and a 70-200 zoom for when I need the reach. And I am not exaggerating when I'm saying that there is rarely an occasion when I need to use the wide or the long lens, and the 50mm prime lives on my camera pretty much all the time. You can replace that wide angle zoom with say a 28mm prime, or if you want to go wider, try a 16mm prime if you like, but I am convinced that there is no better prime lens to center the rest of your lens setup around than a 50mm prime. So why is a 50mm prime so good? To me, it comes down to two things: versatility and character. So let's look at the character of 50mm first. So most people, at least especially on YouTube, will point you in the direction of a 35mm prime as a kind of do-it-all option. 35mm is a very neutral field of view. It is not particularly wide and it is not particularly telephoto, and because of that it works in many scenarios but does not really impart much of a look on the image. In my opinion, 50mm remains just as neutral and true to life, whilst also imparting a little bit more of a look or character onto an image. Mostly because of the added compression thanks to the increased subject to camera working distance and the increased background and foreground separation the tighter focal length offers at similar apertures. To me, the perfect balance. So 50mm really lends itself to blurring out busy backgrounds, or another way that I love to use 50mm primes is isolating interesting patches of color or texture to use as an out of focus backdrop for a portrait like here. I've always found that that little extra bit of crop on 50mm just makes this easier to achieve over something like a 35 or 28mm lens. The same can be said for elements in the foreground too. That same compression and added separation means that you can use foreground elements to add dimension, framing, or texture to the foreground of your image like here without it being too obtrusive. This recipe alone is responsible for some of my favorite images that I have ever taken. So if you ever find yourself out and about struggling for a composition idea, let me break this one down to you. So first of all, find a patch of interesting background. Now this could be bright colors, it could be interesting textures, or anything like that that when it's blurred out is going to create some kind of interesting backdrop behind your subject for them to stand out against. Next, find some kind of foreground element that you can incorporate into the image in front of your subject. That could be something to frame them, or it could just be some added texture or interest in the foreground of the image, like long grass or more flowers like here. The final step is just to shoot at a wide aperture, whether that's 1.8 or 1.4, and then you have a great portrait with tons of depth and you didn't have to work too hard for it. I cannot count how many times I have relied on a 50mm prime lens and this compositional technique to get me out of a situation where I might be on location and it's not a particularly interesting location and I need to pull together a good portrait. It has just never let me down. So my 50mm prime is what I call my storytelling lens. 50mm is just wide enough to show your subject in the context of an entire scene, but it is also tight enough for you to isolate individual elements in a composition that may get lost when using a wider focal length. Because of this, when I am shooting portraits with a 50mm prime lens, I'm always on the lookout for smaller elements that make up the larger scene that add to context or story when isolated. So take these images for example, where thanks to the versatility of a 50mm prime, with just a few steps forward or a few steps backwards, I can capture the scene, the subject, and individual elements with a single prime lens. 50mm excels at isolating smaller details and putting them center stage while still capturing some of the background, something that is really important for things like weddings, for example. So that's why I call it my storytelling lens. It can capture your subject in a wide scene, no problem, but it has this really beautiful way of capturing finer details and just making them look incredible. And this adds to multi-image storyboard-like images that make for great sets on social media or in a gallery. So now you've got some awesome portraits, you need a website to show them off. And this video is sponsored by Squarespace, which is, in my opinion, the best platform for building and hosting websites for photographers and creatives. And the best thing about Squarespace is you don't even need any prior experience in website design or building to create an amazing website thanks to its easy to use fluid engine. You'll be showing off your work to potential customers in no time. Squarespace not only offers amazing customizable galleries for showcasing your work, but if you have products to sell, whether that's physical or digital, Squarespace also offers all the tools you need to create an online store and shopfront to start selling quickly and easily. So if you're ready to dive in and start creating your perfect website, well, head on over to squarespace.com/James Reader to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code James Reader. So in my opinion, 50mm is as versatile as it gets, especially for portrait photography. 50mm just captures stunning full-length portraits where, thanks to that compression and character in combination mentioned earlier, they have plenty of 3D pop that make your subject jump off the background. And with 50mm, you don't have to stand too far away from your subject to capture an entire scene like you would with something like an 85mm prime lens, for example. But without a doubt, mid-length shots are my favorite way to use a 50mm prime lens for portraits. Shooting wide open, or say 1.8 or f2, gives tons of background separation, and the focal length renders facial features in a really flattering way at this kind of working distance. Now, people may steer you away from using a 50mm prime lens for headshots, but I really like it. It has less distortion than wider lenses like a 35mm, for example, and tends to not exaggerate facial features quite as much as a result. And in my experience, a lot of people actually prefer how they look on a 50mm lens compared to longer focal lengths like the classic 85mm or 135mm, as it can slim down the face more than some of these longer lenses with more compression do. We live in a world where most people see themselves through iPhone cameras when taking selfies and things like that, so they're used to seeing themselves at 20mm or 28mm. So it can be a bit of a shock when they see how their face is rendered on a long lens like a 100mm lens, for example. So to me, 50mm is just kind of a nice in-between. And you'll be pleased to know that 50mm is no slouch for travel. Most camera systems have a small, light and cheap 50mm 1.8 prime lens, and in my case I use the Canon 50mm 1.8 or the Nifty 50, as it is super small, super lightweight and an ideal partner for travel. Again, for travel most people would use something like a zoom lens or a more neutral prime lens like a 35mm. So using 50mm for your travel shots can really make them stand out from the rest. For travel shots, I feel that 50mm really imparts an almost cinematic feel to shots, especially when shooting in landscape orientation. Maybe this is because 50mm is such a classic focal length in cinema, in combination with the characteristics we explored earlier. They just have a look about them where wider lenses don't. So let's look at some of the other popular one lens setups, and we'll discuss why I think you should consider a 50mm prime over them. First up is the super useful and versatile 24-70 zoom lens. So the reasons I would personally and do pick a 50mm prime lens over a 24-70 is as follows. So I think a prime like a 50mm will help you hone your compositional skills in the long run, over developing a reliance on zooming in and out like you might on a 24-70. With a prime lens, you have to zoom with your feet, and that means you are moving around and possibly finding new compositional elements to include into an image. And with a zoom lens, you can get lazy, stand in one spot and zoom in and out to capture different images. Reason number two is that a 50mm prime is typically much cheaper than a 24-70 2.8 lens, especially if you look at something like a 50mm 1.8 prime. The final reason is that a 50mm prime is more versatile in low light situations because they tend to have a faster aperture over zoom lenses. And that same fast aperture will give you more background separation than a zoom lens at 2.8. So lens number 2 to put the 50mm against is of course the 35mm prime lens, YouTube's favorite lens, and for good reason because it is just so versatile. But here is why you may want to pick up a 50mm prime instead. Reason number 1 is be different. The go-to setup these days for portraits and weddings and things like that seems to be 35mm prime and an 85mm prime. So if you want to stand out and you want to make your work look a little bit different to everybody else, then maybe go for a 50mm and a 28mm prime setup. This is what I do and I feel that it helps make my work a little bit different. Reason number 2 is that a 50mm prime lens is typically at least cheaper than a 35mm prime lens. I believe that this is because they are a little bit easier to manufacture. So a 50mm 1.8 prime is usually cheaper than a 35mm 1.8 prime. The final reason is that 50mm is a little more flattering on facial features when shooting portraits over the wider 35mm prime lens. So onto some cons. Now, as much as I love the 50mm focal length, there are of course some downsides. So let's quickly run through a few cons of the 50mm focal length or the reliance on a 50mm prime lens. Con number 1, and that is when you are shooting indoors, you may run into an instance where 50mm is just not wide enough. This could be a getting ready room at a wedding, for example, or any time that you are working in a tight space. You may need to pull out a slightly wider focal length to get you covered in those situations. But even if you need, say, a 24mm in that situation, I guarantee you the 50mm will still be useful for picking out details in the scene like we mentioned earlier. The final con is that you might find it a boring focal length. 50mm isn't particularly wide, and it certainly isn't particularly telephoto. The same can be said for 35mm in my opinion, but because it's kind of a jack of all trades, that can mean that it is not the most exciting lens in the world. So that's it. I hope this video was useful. Let me know down below which you prefer, 35mm or 50mm, or maybe you think there's an even more versatile option out there like 28mm or 40mm for example. I would really love to hear your opinion. Thanks as always for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.